The discovery. The notification chimed softly against the marble countertop, a sound so ordinary that Elena Martinez almost ignored it entirely. She was elbow-deep in flour, attempting to recreate her grandmother's empanada recipe for Marcus's birthday dinner, when his phone buzzed with the insistence of something urgent. The screen lit up, and for a moment the name that appeared there seemed like a cruel joke her tired mind was playing on her. Vivian. A message preview that made Elena's heart stutter. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Our secret is safe with me." Elena stared at the glowing screen until it went dark, her hands still covered in dough that suddenly felt heavy as clay. Vivian Rodriguez, Marcus's college girlfriend, the one he claimed to have lost touch with years ago, the one who, according to him, meant nothing anymore, just a ghost from his past that occasionally surfaced in old stories told at dinner parties. She washed her hands methodically, each finger scrubbed clean with the precision of someone trying to wash away more than just flour. The kitchen around her, their kitchen, with its custom cabinets and professional-grade appliances that Marcus had insisted they needed, felt foreign suddenly, like she was standing in a museum exhibit of someone else's life. The phone buzzed. Again. Another message from Vivian. This time Elena didn't look. Instead, she moved through their house like a detective gathering evidence she didn't want to find. In Marcus's home office, she discovered a world she hadn't known existed. Deleted call logs that weren't quite deleted. Browser history carefully cleared, but not completely. And in his desk drawer, locked. But Elena remembered where he kept the spare key. Printed emails dating back 6 months. The correspondence told a story that made Elena's chest tighten with each line she read. Late-night conversations that had evolved from casual catching up to intimate sharing. Plans to meet for coffee that became lunch, then dinner, then weekend getaways disguised as work conferences. Vivian's divorce had been finalized in January. Marcus had been there to comfort her, to listen, to be the friend she needed during her difficult time. "You always understood me better than anyone else," one of Vivian's emails read. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been so young and stupid back then." Marcus's response was worse than Elena could have imagined. "I think about that too, more than I should. Elena's a good woman, but we've grown apart. She's so focused on her work, her art projects. Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a roommate rather than a wife. With you, I feel alive again." Elena sat in Marcus's leather desk chair, the one he'd bought to make working from home more comfortable, the one she'd helped him assemble on. A rainy Sunday morning 2 years ago, and read through months of her marriage, dissolving in carefully crafted sentences. Each message was a small betrayal, but together they formed something that felt insurmountable. The sound of Marcus's key in the front door made Elena move faster than she thought possible. She replaced everything exactly as she'd found it. Locked the drawer and made it back to the kitchen just as he called out his usual greeting. "Hey, beautiful. Something smells incredible in here." Marcus appeared in the doorway, still in his tailored suit, his smile as warm and genuine as it had been every day for the past 8 years. He kissed her cheek, complimented the aroma filling the kitchen, asked about her day with the attentiveness that had first made her fall in love with him. He was exactly the same man she'd married, and somehow that made everything worse. "The empanadas aren't quite ready," Elena heard herself say, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Why don't you get changed? We can eat in about an hour." Marcus nodded, loosening his tie. "Perfect, I'm starving, and honey, thank you for doing this. I know my birthday isn't until tomorrow, but having a quiet dinner tonight feels perfect." After he went upstairs, Eleanor turned off the oven and stared at the half-baked empanadas through the glass door. Tomorrow, Marcus would meet Vivian for lunch. Tomorrow, he would continue building a relationship in the shadows while coming home to Elena each night, kissing her cheek, asking about her day. But tomorrow, Elena wouldn't be here to pretend that her marriage wasn't already over. She wouldn't scream or throw dishes or demand explanations. She wouldn't give him the chance to lie to her face or make promises he had no intention of keeping. Instead, she would do something that Marcus, in all his careful planning of this double life, would never see coming. She would simply disappear. The hollow Victory Marcus Chen stood in his kitchen at 6:47 a.m., holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he stared at the note Elena had left on the granite countertop. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, careful, artistic strokes that had once filled love letters and grocery lists with equal grace. "I can't stay where trust no longer lives. Don't look for me." 12 words. 8 years of marriage reduced to 12 words, written on their wedding stationery. The elegant cream paper they'd chosen together for thank-you notes they'd never finished sending. His first emotion wasn't guilt or panic. It was relief. The suffocating weight of maintaining 2 separate lives, of compartmentalizing his feelings, of careful scheduling and deleted messages lifted from his shoulders like a heavy coat, finally removed. Elena had discovered his relationship with Vivian somehow, and instead of the explosive confrontation he'd been dreading for months, she had simply left. No screaming, no tears, no demands for explanations or promises to change, no lawyers, or division of assets or public humiliation at the country club. Just silence and an empty closet where her clothes used to hang. Marcus called in sick to work, something he hadn't done in 3 years, and spent the morning methodically checking the house. Eleanor had taken only what she needed, 1 suitcase worth of clothes, her laptop, her art supplies, and the small jewelry box her grandmother had given her. Everything else remained untouched, as if she was simply away on a business trip and would return Sunday evening with stories and a small gift from whatever city she'd visited. Her coffee mug still sat in the dishwasher from yesterday morning. Her bookmark marked page 247 in the novel she'd been reading. Her favorite sweater hung in the laundry room, waiting to be folded and returned to its drawer. By afternoon, Marcus had convinced himself this was temporary. Elena needed space to process, to cool down, to realize that his connection with Vivian didn't diminish what they had built together. She would come home in a few days, they would talk like adults, and they would work through this rough patch like mature people who had invested too much in their relationship to simply walk away. He kept his lunch date with Vivian at the small bistro downtown where they'd been meeting for months. She looked radiant in a way that made his chest tighten, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight, her laugh genuine and uninhibited in a way Eleanor's hadn't been in years. "You seem distracted," Vivian said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Everything okay at home?" Marcus hesitated. He hadn't planned to tell her about Elena's departure, hadn't wanted to complicate what they had with the messy reality of his dissolving marriage. But sitting across from Vivian, feeling her fingers against his skin, he realized he wanted to be honest with someone. Finally, "Eleanor left," he said simply. "This morning, she found out about us somehow." Vivian's eyes widened, her hand pulling back slightly. "Oh my God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? What did she say?" "That's just it. She didn't say anything. She left a note and disappeared." For 3 weeks, Marcus lived in the space Elena had created with her silence. He went to work, had dinner with Vivian twice, played racquetball with his colleagues, attended a client cocktail party where everyone asked about Elena, and he made vague excuses about her being out of town visiting family. But slowly, the relief he'd initially felt began to curdle into something else entirely. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, became a mausoleum of their shared life. Elena's absence wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, as if someone had carefully extracted all the warmth and life from every room. He found himself standing in her art studio, a converted bedroom where she spent weekend mornings painting watercolor landscapes that she never showed anyone. Her easel held a half-finished piece, a seascape with dramatic cliffs and churning waves. He'd never paid much attention to her art, had always seen it as a pleasant hobby rather than the passionate pursuit it clearly was. Now, surrounded by canvases and brushes and tubes of paint in colors he couldn't name, Marcus realized how little he actually knew about the woman he'd been married to for 8 years. When had she started painting seascapes? What drew her to those wild, untamed coastlines? Had she dreamed of visiting places like that, and had he been too self-absorbed to notice? The worst part wasn't the guilt, though that came in waves that left him gasping. The worst part was the creeping understanding that Elena's silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. She had looked at their marriage, assessed what it had become, and made a decision with the kind of clarity he'd never possessed. She hadn't left him because she was weak or emotional or unable to handle adult complexity. She'd left him because she was strong enough to choose herself over the scraps of affection he'd been offering her while investing his real emotional energy elsewhere. The end of the 3rd week, Marcus couldn't sleep in their bed anymore. Elena's pillow still smelled faintly of her shampoo, and the space she'd occupied felt like a crater next to him. He moved to the guest room, but even there, he could feel the weight of her absence pressing against his chest like a physical thing. Vivian suggested he file for divorce, move forward with his life, stop torturing himself over someone who had abandoned their marriage without even trying to fight for it. But when Marcus tried to imagine signing papers, dividing their possessions, making their separation legal and final, something inside him recoiled. Elena hadn't abandoned their marriage. She had simply refused to participate in its slow destruction while he built something else in secret. She had chosen dignity over drama, silence over spectacle, and somehow that quiet exit had broken him more completely than any screaming match ever could have. Part 3. The Escape. The salt air hit Elena Martinez's face like a benediction as she stepped off the Greyhound bus in Millfield, Oregon, a coastal town so small it barely warranted a dot on most maps. She had chosen it precisely because it was the kind of place Marcus would never think to look, not glamorous enough for his tastes, not connected enough for his network, not important enough for his consideration. The bus driver, a weathered man with kind eyes, helped her retrieve her single suitcase from the cargo hold. "You picked a good time to visit," he said, nodding toward the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like toys in a bathtub. "Summer's just starting. Town comes alive." This time of year, Elena didn't correct him. She wasn't visiting. She was disappearing. The Millfield Inn sat 3 blocks from the harbor, a Victorian house converted into a bed and breakfast that advertised reasonable weekly rates for extended stays. The proprietor, a woman named Dorothy, who looked to be in her 70s, didn't ask questions when Eleanor paid cash for a month in advance. "Room 4 has the best view of the water," Dorothy said, handing Eleanor an old-fashioned brass key. "Breakfast is at 8, but I can make exceptions if you're one of those early risers. You running from something, honey, or running toward something?" The directness of the question caught Elena off guard. "I'm not sure yet," Dorothy nodded, as if this was a perfectly reasonable answer. "Well, Millfield's a good place for figuring that out. Nothing happens fast here, which gives a person time to think." Elena's room was small but clean, with whitewashed walls and a window that looked out over the harbor. She sat on the narrow bed and opened her phone for the first time since leaving Portland. 17 missed calls from Marcus, 43 text messages that she deleted without reading, 6 voicemails that she would probably never listen to. She powered the phone off and tucked it into the bottom of her suitcase. For the first week, Eleanor barely left her room, except for meals at the inn's dining room and long walks along the harbor. The town operated on rhythms entirely foreign to her. Fishing boats departed before dawn, returned by mid-morning with their catch. The few shops opened late and closed early. People moved with the deliberate pace of those who had nowhere urgent to be. On her 8th day in Millfield, Elena discovered Turning Page, a combination bookshop and cafe tucked into a narrow building 2 blocks from the water. The owner, a man named Robert, who looked to be in his 60s, was trying to balance running the register while attempting to fix an espresso machine that seemed determined to spray steam in every direction except where it was supposed to. Need help? Elena asked, setting down the mystery novel she'd been considering. Robert looked up, his grey hair disheveled and his apron stained with what she hoped was coffee. You know anything about temperamental Italian machinery? Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. I know about temperamental everything. Let me take a look. 20 minutes later, the espresso machine was humming contentedly, and Robert was pressing a perfectly crafted cappuccino into Elena's hands. Where did you learn to do that? You interested in a job? Robert asked. I've been trying to find help for months, but most folks around here either fish or work at the resort up the coast. Nobody wants to spend their days with books and coffee. Elena looked around the shop. The reckoning Marcus Chen's BMW looked absurdly out of place on Millfield's main street, its sleek lines and polished chrome a stark contrast to the weathered pickup trucks and salt-stained sedans that comprised most of the town's automotive landscape. He had been driving for 6 hours, following a trail that had taken him 3 months to piece together. Bank records, credit card statements, phone pings, and finally a conversation with Elena's college roommate, who had reluctantly admitted she'd received a postcard from the Oregon coast. The private investigator Marcus had hired could have done this work faster, but something had stopped him from making that call. Perhaps it was the understanding that tracking down his wife like a fugitive would make their situation irreversibly sordid. Or perhaps it was the growing suspicion that he needed to make this journey himself, to understand not just where Elena had gone, but why she had needed to disappear so completely. Millfield was smaller than he had imagined, the kind of place where his arrival would be noted and discussed over coffee within hours. He parked outside what appeared to be the town's only bookstore and sat for a moment, trying to gather the courage he'd somehow lost during the drive down the coast. Through the window, he could see a woman behind the counter, her back to him as she arranged books on a shelf. She was wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a way that looked casual but deliberate. Something about her posture, the confidence in her movements, the economy of her gestures, seemed familiar, but when she turned around, Marcus felt his breath catch. It was Elena, but not the Elena he had been living with for the past few years. This version of his wife looked awake. There was color in her cheeks, brightness in her eyes, and something in her expression that he realized he hadn't seen in their house for a very long time. Contentment. She was laughing at something a customer had said, her whole face transformed by genuine amusement. And Marcus felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy or might have been grief. When was the last time he had made Elena laugh like that? He sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching her work. She moved through the bookshop like someone who belonged there, recommending titles with enthusiasm, operating the espresso machine with practiced ease, engaging each customer in conversation that seemed to flow naturally rather than being performed out of politeness. This was Eleanor's life now. This small-town bookshop, these conversations with strangers about books and coffee preferences, this world that existed entirely without him. She had built something here in 3 months, something real and satisfying and completely her own. Marcus finally entered the shop during a lull in customers, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime that felt mocking under the circumstances. Elena looked up from the inventory sheet she was reviewing, and the transformation in her expression was immediate and devastating. The light went out of her eyes. Her shoulders tensed. The woman who had been laughing easily with customers a few minutes earlier became guarded and careful, as if Marcus were a dangerous animal that might attack without warning. "Hello, Elena." "Marcus." Her voice was steady but distant, the tone she might use with a stranger asking for directions. "How did you find me?" "Does it matter?" She considered this for a moment. "No, I suppose it doesn't. What do you want?" The directness of the question threw him. In their old life, conversations had been layered with subtext and careful navigation. Around difficult topics, Elena had always been diplomatic, circuitous in her approach to conflict. This version of her asked for exactly what she wanted to know. "I want to talk. I want to explain." "There's nothing to explain, Marcus. I found your emails. I know about Vivian. I know about the lunches and the weekend conferences that weren't actually conferences. I know you told her our marriage felt like living with a roommate." Eleanor's voice never rose above conversational volume, but each word landed with precision. "What exactly do you think needs explaining?" Marcus had rehearsed this conversation during the 6-hour drive, had prepared explanations and apologies and promises. But standing in this bookshop, looking at the woman Elena had become without him, all of his carefully planned words felt inadequate. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "No, you made a choice. Multiple choices, actually, over the course of 6 months. You chose to reconnect with Vivian. You chose to meet her for coffee, then lunch, then dinner. You chose to share our private business with her. You chose to tell her that you felt more alive with her than you did with me." Elena's tone remained calm, almost clinical. "Those weren't mistakes, Marcus. They were decisions. But I love you. You love the idea of me. You love having a wife who manages your social calendar and remembers your mother's birthday and looks appropriate at firm events. But you don't love me, the actual person. You don't even know who that is." The truth of this hit Marcus like a physical blow. Standing in this bookshop, seeing Elena in her element, he realized she was right. He had been married to a version of Elena that existed primarily to support his life, his career, his needs. He had never asked what she wanted or needed or dreamed about. "I want to try again," he said. "I want to know who you are now. I want us to start over." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus allowed himself to hope that his words had reached her, that the connection they had once shared might still exist somewhere beneath the hurt and distance. "I don't," she said finally. "I don't want to start over with you, Marcus. I don't want to go back to being the woman I was when we were married. I like who I am now. I like my life here. I'd like waking up each morning and not having to consider anyone else's needs before my own. But we're married on paper. But we stopped being married in any way that matters months before I left. You just didn't notice because I was still there to maintain the illusion." A customer entered the shop, and Elena immediately shifted her attention to them with the kind of warm professionalism that made Marcus understand how quickly she had become part of this community. She belonged here in a way she had never belonged in their house, their life, their marriage. When the customer left, Elena turned back to him. "I'll sign whatever papers you need me to sign. You can keep the house, the accounts, all of it. I just want to be left alone to live my life." Marcus looked around the bookshop, at the carefully curated displays, the cozy reading nooks, the art on the walls that he now realized Elena had probably helped select. This wasn't a temporary escape or a phase she was going through. This was her home now, and she had created it without him, without reference to him, without any need for his approval or support. "Elena, please." "Goodbye, Marcus." She returned to her inventory sheet, effectively dismissing him from her presence and her life with the same quiet finality that had characterized her original departure. Marcus stood there for another moment, waiting for her to look up, to give him some sign that the 8 years they had shared meant something to her. But Elena had moved on with the same definitiveness with which she had left, and Marcus finally understood that some exits were permanent, no matter how desperately you wanted to reopen the door. Part 5. New Beginnings. James had appeared in her life the way most good things in Millfield did, gradually, naturally, without fanfare or dramatic gestures. He had been a regular at Turning Page since her second week in town, arriving each Tuesday morning for coffee and whichever book Robert recommended, staying long enough to read the first chapter before heading off to whatever project demanded his attention that day. Unlike the rushed interactions Eleanor remembered from her old life, conversations with James unfolded at their own pace. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. When she mentioned missing the art supplies she'd left behind in Portland, he'd appeared the following week with a set of watercolors and brushes he'd ordered from a catalogue, presenting them with the casual observation that the lighthouse at sunset might make an interesting subject. "You don't have to watch me work, you know," James called down from the platform, his voice carrying easily in the salt air. "Though I have to admit it's nice having an audience who appreciates craftsmanship." Elena climbed the narrow path to where he was working, careful to stay out of his way as he measured and cut boards with practiced efficiency. "I like watching people who are good at what they do. There's something satisfying about competence." James paused in his work to look at her, his brown eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that had first caught her attention. "Is that what this is? Professional admiration?" Among other things, Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that had been appearing more frequently in James's presence, not the anxious concern about saying the wrong thing that had characterized her interactions with Marcus, but the anticipatory excitement of someone discovering they might be falling in love. It had been